day. So Ibrahim very kindly agreed to do it on Zoom. So that's how we're doing it. I'm sorry, but next time we'll be meeting together. Fundamentally, this is a time to remember the history of the Kurdish people, denied 100 years ago the ability to have an independent state of Kurdish people at the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Systematic discrimination in all countries where the Kurdish people lived ever since then, and the understandable and utter determination of Kurdish people to maintain their language, their identity, and their right to their own self-determination. And this has cost the lives of thousands of people in wars in Iraq, in Turkey, in Syria, and so on, all across the piece. And so I have the greatest respect for Kurdish history, Kurdish culture, and Kurdish identity. And having visited all parts of Kurdistan at various times over the years, I have some understanding of the depths of that determination that Kurdish people should be able to lead and live their lives the way they want to, using the language and the heritage and the customs that they've been brought up with. But it hasn't been a life of peace by any manner of means. And the earthquake that's now happened in Turkey and Syria shows just how brutal the war against Kurdish people have been, the paucity of aid that's gone to the Kurdish people trying to survive in the midst of the conflict in Syria, and the incompetence of the delivery of aid to people in southern Turkey in the Kurdish-speaking areas. And it is that determination that we have, obviously, to send as much aid and support as we can, as quickly as we can, to make sure it gets there. I'm not clear whether the best form of aid is actually sending money that can be spent to regenerate the local economy and local businesses, or whether it's best to send physical aid or a combination of both. But I would have to say I was impressed, and I hope it's all happened okay, that Qatar promised to deliver several tens of thousands of temporary homes to people in order to give them a place of some degree of safety in the midst of appalling and very, very cold weather. So it is about that sense of solidarity that we have to register that today. And it's very interesting that the media, and indeed in Parliament, when the issue of the earthquake came up, it was as though Kurdish language and the Kurdish people should never even get a mention in this, and it was all framed around the existing national borders of the countries. That has begun to change a bit, but it needs to change a lot more. But it's also about what happens in the long term. We cannot go on with Ocalan being in prison all these decades under attack, and now in prison in isolation. We don't know what his condition is. We don't know much about what's happening to him, except that he is in complete isolation. If we want a peace process, and we do want a peace process, we do want something that avoids death and killing and occupation, then there has to be talks, as with every war and every conflict. And those talks have to include the representatives of the people. And so there was no peace in South Africa whilst apartheid continued, whilst the ANC leadership was in prison. Eventually, the ANC leadership, particularly important was obviously Nelson Mandela, were released from prison. Talks took place. The apartheid regime was ended, and whilst life hasn't been easy or plain sailing for South Africa since then, at least it is very different, and there is not the degree of racism and discrimination there was under apartheid. So it is about talks. Nearer to home, I remember being condemned very heavily in the 1980s as a member of parliament for calling for talks with the Irish Republicans, who were obviously involved in a conflict over the British military presence in Northern Ireland at that time. 15 years later, a peace process developed quite quickly after a mutually agreed ceasefire, and we had the Belfast Agreement, and we have a completely different atmosphere in Ireland at the present time. And so it shows to me that there has to be a peace process, and that has to be by the talks with the representatives of the Kurdish communities in all countries that make up Kurdistan. And that's why I support the freedom of Ocalan to be the person who can lead and negotiate all of that. But I also just want to send this message now to the huge Kurdish community in Britain, particularly in London, obviously in my own community of Islington North. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the massive contribution you make to our local community, society and economy. And thank you for the very practical help you send to people back home all the time. And I've just been watching the determination of so many people in my community to make sure that we get aid to where it's needed to the Kurdish people as rapidly as possible. And so I will be supporting that appeal for funds and appeal for goods to be sent and working with you to make sure it happens. But when the news media move on from the horrific effects of this earthquake, I hope they'll begin to look at the buildings that collapsed and the buildings that didn't, and look at the system of building controls which allowed buildings to be put up that clearly were not fit for purpose and have resulted in the deaths of so many lives. I was looking last night at BBC News about a hospital that has been completely destroyed, and apparently it was identified many years ago, I think 10 years ago, as being not safe to be in an earthquake zone, and nothing was done about it. And so in the rebuilding, let's send our solidarity and our support, make sure that the buildings that are reconstructed are as proof against an earthquake as it's possible to be. But above all, let's send that message. We want the right of Kurdish people to be able to live their own lives and self-determination, which is a right for everyone all over the world, to take precedence in this. And that's why I'm really pleased to be able to support the meeting today, and no doubt there'll be many other meetings and events that we'll be together at and taking part in. Long live the Kurdish people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy Corbyn, for your